but forgot about that. The title is a bit vague, but really, what we're going to focus on is the Maju part of this, and literally, it's this idea of sort of like moving forward and going backward. I'll elaborate a bit more. So we'll spend thinking about that. Usually, we're going to everything up. I'm going to sort of like kind of take us back to all of the previous trees, because again, this session has been a bit theoretically dense. So we're going to circle back a bit, and then we're going to wrap things up, and then that's going to be our setup for all of the sessions sort of going forward. So okay, let's get into it. So I want us to go back to this picture that we sort of put up in our Instagram, and this specific landmark that I want to highlight is the shrine of Mbak Priok. He's sort of like a religious figure, a saint, an Islamic saint, and he's sort of his tomb, his shrine here is sort of just sitting right in the middle of Tanjung Priok, which is sort of like the main port in Jakarta. And this was like sort of it was the site of a lot of kind of like a lot of protests actually, because again, notice in the picture, like this is literally just a shrine in the middle of like a shipping sort of terminal. These are all like cargo, sort of like stacks of like cargo boxes, and then you have all of this ships. So this is basically like an industrial shipping logistics site, and just right in the middle is this shrine. And so there were a lot of sort of like conflicts to sort of like basically knock it down. So you want to sort of fortify the whole thing. I'm not going to go too much into a lot of these sort of protests, but what I want to really kind of call your attention to is sort of what comes to mind when we think about this, or even when we think about the discourses and the way people talk about situations like this. There's a sense of, at least within certain segments of people who grew up in Jakarta, that's just me making an assumption, you look at this and you're like, this is weird, right? This is like, it doesn't feel, what's the word? It feels strange. Like this thing feels out of place. Like, what is a shrine doing in the midst of industrial activity? It doesn't make sense. They're not supposed to be compatible. And that's sort of the logic that I want to unpack a bit. Like, why do we think that? Why is a shrine? Why is Mbak Priok's resting place somehow weird, somehow out of place when we put it in the midst of all of these shipping containers? Aside from like sort of like, this is getting in the way of like trucks and all of these like coal like vehicles trying to manage all of this. And this is sort of a quote that I took from Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe. And this captures, right, the sense of what we're talking about, the sense of like, this is kind of out of place. And let's read through the quote a bit more, because I think it reveals sort of a lot of the structure in how we think about these things. It's almost a cliche to describe Indonesia, and he says India here, but let's sort of swap out the examples. It's precisely that state of contradiction. Right? It's a state of contradiction in which the shrine of Mbak Priok can stand by the side of the modern port of Tanjung Priok. Right? It's like almost, it's weird. It's a contradiction. And then here he gives more examples of nuclear scientists can start the day by offering puja, offerings to a clay god. And this is almost a whole genre, if you think about it, right? There's so much stuff. Like, think about like travelogues or like documentaries on, say, Bali, right? And like you want to, like, stereotypically, what is it? It's like, you imagine like some narrator with a British accent going, Bali, a site of contradiction. The Indonesian folk are such spiritual people. They go out to work, they go to their factories, modern life exists, but then they also have the sesajen, and that's weird because it doesn't. So what's going on here? And I think Chakrabarty is holding on to something, right? Where he says here that, again, this is a quote he takes, he sort of analyzes a bunch of sort of like newspaper articles, the Wall Street Journal in particular, and he writes here that this is sort of like what's going on in the trope, that Indians are capable of living in several centuries at once. And I would sort of posit that why this feels weird is because there is something in the way we think that sort of like points the shrine of Mbak Priok as something in like some distant past, in like an old century, whereas this shipping port belongs to the current, the modern century. So what's really going on here? It's like this sense of like there are two different times that cannot coexist together, right? And again, you can sort of already see how this might be relevant for Indonesians, because it's sort of like it goes into these sort of conversations about, is Indonesia pre-modern? Is it not modern enough? Is it backwards? Because there's so much that we see in Indonesia that sort of lives in a different century. It's not supposed to be modern. It's not supposed to exist in the current century. It's an anachronism. And just to sort of give more concrete examples and to sort of flesh this idea a bit more, a really good example of this kind of thinking is Marxism, and especially sort of the historical materialism that you see in it. And here I have this quote from Marx Das Kapital, and let's read it together, because again, it's very telling. Here he's analyzing the economic conditions in Germany, and he says it's worse in England. But again, look at the language. Why is it worse than England? Because we suffer not only from capitalist production, but the fact that development of capitalism is not complete. It's incomplete. Again, think about it. Again, this maju, right? And the sense of time. There's this sense of capitalism is moving through history. It's developing, and then it's not complete yet. And the next line is even more telling. Alongside the modern evils of capitalism, we are oppressed by a whole series of inherited evils arising from the passive survival of, again, the language is striking, archaic and outmoded modes of production, right? Again, anachronisms. These modes of production can be long in this century with their accompanying train of anachronistic social and political relations. We suffer not only from the living, but from the dead. And again, this is sort of a very overly simplified schema of sort of how Marxist historicism looks at sort of historical sort of development. And you see this sort of like transition from different economic states, from primitive economics to ancient to feudal. And what Marx is basically arguing is that why is Germany so problematic? It's because you're sort of somewhere here. You're still stuck with the baggage of the feudal past, and you're sort of still, but you're already kind of transitioning to capitalism. So you face the problems of both. But again, it's that same idea, right? You have this timeline and you're moving through it, and it's like we're not moving fast enough. We're stuck somewhere in this zombie state almost. And that, if you sort of try to project what we were talking about with Mbak Priok, we can sort of like understand it from this lens too, right? Why does it feel anachronistic to have Mbak Priok's shrine in the middle of the port of Tanjung Priok? It's because of this. It's because it belongs to a different time. And now the question that we want to ask is that if we're thinking society, if we're thinking about the world, if we're thinking about history, if we're thinking about time in this lens, what happens? Can two different centuries, can two different times coexist in the same period? And again, that matters a lot for talking about places like Indonesia. Or more broadly, we'll get to that. Places outside of Europe. And you might say, oh, I'm not a Marxist. That doesn't matter to me. Okay, Marxists are not irrelevant. The end of history, all of history is moving towards liberal democracy, free markets, liberal economics, liberal democracy, all of that. That's the end state of history. It's the same logic. Everyone's supposed to move there, and history is moving in that direction. And then if you don't move in that, and then if you kind of like resist it, you're behind the times, right? And even in that lens, if you look at a lot of the developmentalist discourse in Indonesia, again, the language of catching up. It's the same thing, right? You're putting some countries on this timeline, you're like, you want to catch up with them. You're putting everything on this linear timeline. And then, of course, then everything that is sort of behind looks incomplete, looks not modern enough. And of course, you see like this dissonance that emerges when you run into, when this doesn't enter, when things don't play out the way you expect to. And the canonical example here is China. China is going to democratize as long as its economy liberalizes. That's sort of always been the conception of the American foreign policy establishment since Nixon, I guess. And it doesn't happen, right? That's sort of like this historical trajectory didn't play out the way it needed to. And then that's a lot of the tensions within this sort of like way of thinking. So that's just a brief little primer, a little sort of like motivating series of motivating examples for the topic of today, which is that again, the sense that history is moving forward, right? There's this timeline. It has a direction. It's moving forward, and you know, it's going somewhere. And a series of auxiliary questions kind of rise up when we think in that way. Because when we think of history as this timeline, one question that pops up is like, okay, if that's what is moving through it? If you know, if we think of history as this like timeline, who is the protagonist of it? Who is the character moving through it? You and I as individuals, that makes sense in a certain sense, right? I am growing old, I'm moving through history, we all are. Or maybe something more abstract, like society. Is society moving through history? Is it developing? And what kinds of society? We can think of religious societies, like maybe the Islamic Umat Islam, maybe a social class. The proletariat is moving through history, is developing. The bourgeois is moving through history. They're developing, or maybe bangsa, a nation. And so that's sort of the kind of question. That's one question that comes up. And then, of course, everything we've been talking about. Once we've posited this timeline, once we've posited these main characters, we place them on this timeline, and then we sort of assign moral value based on what they stand, right? If we have a society that we've deemed as like, you know, it's modern society, it has the characteristics of what it means to live in 2026, as compared to a society that we've deemed to be like, okay, this is 200 BC, this is 200 AD. That's backwards. You get to rank all of these different social entities on this sort of timeline. And again, I promise you, we're going to sort of like, again, we're going to step out of Indonesia and we're going to sort of like zoom back a bit. We're going to go to Europe, we're going to go to other traditions, but I promise we'll eventually go back to the idea of Indonesia, because my argument here is that Indonesian nationalism, the idea of Indonesia, is deeply, deeply dependent on this sense of time, on this sense of history. So this is not a very new idea. This has very, very ancient antecedents. And the big one here is the Old Testament. And one of my former history professors puts it quite well, which is the historical contribution of the Jewish tradition is that it was one of the first to really posit that history has a direction. History has a purpose, it's going somewhere. And if any of you sort of like has read the Old Testament or is even just familiar with like the Abrahamic tradition, this is quite clear. You start there's a catalyst, there's a big bang in the beginning. And what is that? That's original sin. Adam and Eve eat the apple in the Garden of Eden. And then because of that, they lose their innocence. They disobey God. And this starts the journey because it precipitates a fall. They sort of descend from this state of purity, from this state of goodness. And in that state of goodness, they're estranged from God because they don't obey God. And then the rest of the Old Testament is really the narrative that unfolds over that. And there's a purpose to it, right? The Jews are the chosen people of God. All the trials that the Jews go through are part of God's divine plan, a divine plan that's going to culminate somewhere in the return to Jerusalem, in the coming of the Messiah. And Islam and Christianity basically build on that. They build on that narrative. They sort of tweak it in their own different ways, but they sort of like, you know, they sort of riff on it, right? In Christianity, it's like, well, the Messiah is Jesus. And in Islam, it's sort of like, well, they're all these different prophets are part of this lineage, and Muhammad is the last one. But everyone before us has sort of like, kind of like falsely interpreted the stories. But again, the thing that I want to focus on is that sense that history is moving linearly, like a straight line towards something. Although here, that purpose of history is divinely ordained. And this is a bit of a contrite example, but again, I just want to sort of mention it because again, this is not the only way to think of history. The example I have in mind is the Romance of the Two Kingdoms. It's sort of the most popular classical Chinese text. I'm sure, I mean, I don't know if you all like are familiar with like Liu Bei, Cao Cao, all those like characters, and some of my friends played a lot of video games related to this. But essentially, this is the opening line of the text. Kingdom long divided, must unite, long united, must divide. And you get that cyclicality, right? The kingdom is united and it has to divide. And then once it's divided, and when you actually read through the text, you do get that sense. You get that sense that there is a period of prolonged unity, and then that sort of like creates these sort of pressures. And you can sense that momentum. And again, if you've read the book or you're familiar with the story, my sense is that what's driving it is really like basically like generational churn. Like essentially like you have a time period that's it's chaotic, the kingdom is falling apart, and then like very competent warlords like come up. And then that drives the narrative, that drives the division and everything. But then they die, and then their kids are kind of dumb, not as good as them. And that's why everything sort of starts ossifying again. And because of this specification, a new generation from different families comes, and then they try to reunite. And then you get, but again, it's cyclical. It's not really going anywhere. It's kind of separate note, but there is a theory that why Marxism sort of like resonated with some Chinese was that to them it provided a way out of this. It provided a way out of the cyclicality, but that's just a bit of a footnote. So yeah, this is old. This is dates all the way. This has Abrahamic sort of like precedents. And then we're going to go to sort of back to the period that we've been talking about all this time. And again, it's linked to how sort of like we think about Indonesia, again, because of the colonial influence. And again, it's the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is basically the same thing. It has the same, there's like a lot of these narrative structures in place. Again, and one of the debates that when we think about the Enlightenment is like sort of, people often think about the Enlightenment in terms of ideas. What was the Enlightenment really? And then they might say, okay, it's these ideas of like rationality triumphing over faith, maybe, or like this emergence of science, or respect for individual rights, or sort of like the emergence of democracies and republics. It's this critique against monarchy. And that's sort of embedded in a lot of the popular understandings of the Enlightenment, even though, again, it's a bit more complicated than that. But here I'm drawing on the argument of Dan Edelstein, who's a French studies scholar, and he writes that when you actually boil it down, because again, ideologically, there's all these popular conceptions of the Enlightenment, but it's not that straight, it's not that clear cut. You have other Enlightenment figures who are sort of like considered part of the Enlightenment, but they're absolutist. And sometimes they might even be like religious apologists. So again, that ideological sort of like grouping doesn't entirely make sense. And he argues what is more common amongst them is that the Enlightenment was a narratological invasion. Basically, a bunch of French scholars, the 1680s, even 1680s and 1720s, they sort of like, it was in the French academies, they were sort of part of this whole academic debate called the quarrel of the ancients and moderns. And I won't go into it that much, but essentially the gist of it is that you've seen, if you've been on like history or Reddit forums, there's like, is the Ottoman Empire greater than the Byzantines? Is the feudal age better? That's basically the kind of debate that was happening. But from out of this very like nerdy debate came this sense of like narrative of history, and that was the narrative of the Enlightenment. And at the key of it was, again, this picture sort of illustrates it, this sort of the light, l'esprit philosophique, that's what he says, the spirit of philosophy, the spirit of reason, shining light on everything. And it's very specific to the history of Europe up until that time. And this is again, we put this up in one of the previous lectures. I just want to put it again because it highlights sort of the Enlightenment narrative quite clearly. Again, it's a narrative, right? This is from l'Encyclopédie, which is sort of like considered one of the seminal texts, like sort of the representative text of the Enlightenment. And again, look at the narrative structure. And again, I want you to keep the Old Testament in mind again here. There had been centuries of enlightenment. And again, spoiler alert, this was what? This was ancient. It was ancient Greece and Rome. The Greeks and the Romans, so smart. Oh my God, philosophers, so smart. And then we just got dumb. We fell into the dark ages. 12 centuries, 12 centuries of ignorance, of darkness. Why? Because of superstition, because we lost all of these arts of philosophy and reason. And then what happened? The Byzantine Empire was destroyed, fall of Constantinople, sacked by the Ottomans. And then you see this migration from Constantinople all the way to Europe, and that this sparks the Renaissance. This sort of like this return of knowledge that was lost, this old Greek knowledge. So notice how that mirrors, kind of, in some ways, the structure of the Old Testament, right? You had original sin. What was original sin? The fall of Greek and Roman civilization. That was the original sin. You had this period of darkness, and then moving through slowly, Renaissance, enlightenment. Light has returned to society. And that's the basic narrative structure, right? The Enlightenment was seen as this sort of like process by which society would become more and more enlightened as we moved away from this like old feudal past. And again, this quote is actually from Fatini, right? Habis gelap terbitlah terang, from darkness unto light. And again, this is because again, Fatini was part of the. And again, what I want to show here is that this played a very important role, especially in the way the ethical policy generation were sort of like they were sort of like amongst some of the first nationalists in Indonesia were thinking along these terms of sort of like progress and modernity. So that's the Enlightenment. One other thing though that I want to sort of like highlight is that the Enlightenment was really, and this goes back to the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. It's really a combination of two narratives. The first is what we've just been talking about. That's the narrative of Renaissance. And that's the position of the ancients, right? It's sort of like the ancients were so great. The Greeks and Romans were so smart, so good. So that was one narrative. But there was another one that was going on, which was the narrative of scientific revolution. And that's where it's sort of like what we think about as modern today with like scientific progress, reason, that's sort of more associated with this in a more popular sense, I think. And what happened, and again, the narrative sort of understanding of this sort of period is that this is around the 15th to 17th centuries, what was normally labeled the scientific revolution with and figures usually cited are Bacon, Descartes, and Newton. Again, if you're interested, our session, I think, at a 4 a.m. session where we talk about all of this. So if you want to know about this in more detail, you can always go back to that. But essentially, it's that same narrative. You have this period of ignorance, and here the school of thought is called scholasticism, which dominated late medieval Europe, and it's basically like Aristotle. It's like, I don't know if this is doing it justice, but it's essentially a kind of like Christianized Aristotelianism with certain ways of thinking about the world. And again, I'm not going into too much detail, but essentially the system of Bacon, Descartes, and Newton overturned that. At least that's how the narrative goes. It overturns that and it ushers into this like new scientific method that is better at getting at the truth. And then that's how. And you combine these two narratives. And this combination is crucial because a narrative solely of scientific revolution is in some sense, not entirely, but in some sense, is a narrative mostly of just modernity and science. This is how you get more modern. This is how you got more scientific. Combined with the narrative of Renaissance, this creates a narrative not just of modernity, but of the West. The West's self-conception of itself, because you're drawing a line all the way back from ancient Greece and Rome into Newton. This is how the West understands itself. And a really good example of this at work is these are like excerpts from like the reading list from St. John's College, which is a liberal arts sort of college in the US. And it's sort of like the closest thing you can get to what liberal arts education would look like before World War II, I think. Not too familiar with history. But again, look what's happening, right? The freshman year, this is ancient Greece, Aeschylus, Archimedes, Aristotle. And then the sophomore year, the Bible is also there somewhere. And this is sort of like the Christian tradition. You have Dante and the Divine Comedy, you have Descartes, and then senior year is sort of modern philosophy and literature. And again, you're drawing that straight line. And again, this is a creation in the sense that what does Plato, what does Aristotle have to do with George Washington? What do they have to do with Elon Musk? Like if you put them together, if you take Plato and you put him in a room with Elon Musk, and Elon's like, "You're my ancestor," what would you say? Would you be like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah," or like, and if you actually read the text, it's not clear. It's you know, it's kind of like that. You're claiming him, right? And then if like someone's like, "Oh, Plato wouldn't," Plato and Aristotle and all of these thinkers of the West, you know, Elon Musk, George Washington are not compatible with that. Therefore, they are not the West. What happens next? They'll make a counter argument. No, 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 no. I am actually Platonic in this way. I'm actually Aristotelian in this way. I'm actually Christian in this way. You have to make this argument retroactively, right? And then that's how you get all these debates about like who's a really Western thinker. And then where this gets really interesting is when you talk about Islamic thinkers in the classical age. So especially people like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, because again, in some sense, you could say, and you kind of see this dilemma when you see like, for example, Columbia's Common Core, where they compile these reading lists because sort of they, in some ways, yes, in the intellectual trajectory of the West, they are important because they sort of like engage with a lot of like ancient with Platonic and Aristotelian ideas, and then during the Renaissance, these ideas like migrated back to Europe. So in a sense, yes, that's important, but it's like, hey, really the West? That's sort of the thinking that you'd see, right? It's like, but this is the Islamic world. The Islamic world isn't part of the West. So again, why I'm spending so much time on these examples is because I really want to like hammer home the fact that again, the West itself, like you know, we think of it as something that's like so natural. The West is like all of these white people from Europe and America. It's not that simple. It's quite like it's actually a lot of it's fabricated. A lot of it's fabricated. This sense of like lineage again. Like what does Elon Musk have to do with Plato? And I would argue not a lot. Uh, maybe something. I don't know. Actually, so yeah. So that and that is relevant to when we eventually start talking about Indonesia again. So again, hold that in your head. So far, we've been seeing how the Enlightenment's narrative structure parallels the Old Testament and sort of like a lot of these older sort of Abrahamic traditions. But it is one crucial thing that's very, very different is that it secularizes this narrative. Remember, we talked about the timelines, like who's the protagonist of the timeline? When we're talking about Abrahamic narratives, the protagonist is quite straightforward. It's sort of like it's God or like the divine people. It's divinely ordained. But what happens when God steps out of the picture? When this historical timeline becomes, in the word of Walter Benjamin, empty. It becomes empty. What steps into that vacuum? And again, this is back again from Edelstein. What was so different about the Enlightenment narrative is that a lot of narrative structures in the past focused on great figures, great men, right? It's like, oh, there's this king, there's this prophet. And again, you can kind of see that even in the Old Testament, right? That we structured it in some sense by like the kind of prophets, like Ezekiel, Daniel. Here it's a new protagonist, society. And again, society is one of those other words where it feels so natural to us. It feels so obvious that, of course, we live in a society. Duh. But there's been a lot of good work that's shown that, like, even the concept and the word of society was itself a historical emergence. It emerged and like spread in Europe across the 13th, 15th centuries in the lead up to sort of like what we call the Enlightenment. So this period is like pushed. I don't want to go too much into detail in this because we're going to talk about this more when we get to Marx, when we get to social science, how we get to sort of like this thinking about society and like changing the society. What I want to focus on here is mostly just the fact that like society becomes the main protagonist. And again, it has to do with like changes in religiosity and secularization. Again, this is beautiful, very evocative language, so spend a bit of time with it, right? Society becomes the ontological frame of our human existence, a divinity on earth. The entire sphere, the entire world of all human interaction. That wasn't always how people use the word society. It used to be just like talk about voluntary associations, like you all get together in a group, of course you're a society. But now it becomes like all human interaction. All human interaction becomes society. And again, it's linked to religiosity. Calvinism introduced such a breach between this world and the next that even Catholics came to consider the realm of the divine as inherently separate from the world of humans. So again, society, in other words, was all that was left once God has departed from the scene. And why does that matter for us? Because again, it goes back to like, who are these protagonists moving through historical time? And this is Benedict Anderson's famous quote, right? Sociological entities moving through empty, homogeneous time. And what are these sociological entities? They could be the state in the Hobbesian sense. They could be, that's a sociological entity, right? Capitalism, that's a sociological entity. That's an entire economic system. Socialism would be a sociological entity too. Classes, if you think, or any like segment of society that you can think of, and you name like a grouping, right? Like for example, Yagi or proletarian, bourgeois, santri in the Geertzian sense. Like these are all sociological entities, and of course, so is the nation. The nation is a sociological entity, right? It sort of like is imagined as sort of like this protagonist of historical time. And so we're left with this sort of enlightenment and this European sense of history. And again, this is like a very, very like textbook sort of like chronological ordering of like important events in European history, right? Greece and Rome, all the way to the French Industrial Revolutions. And then you can sort of map all these sociological entities into this timeline, right? Which is why if you look at some social science stuff, they'll say something like, okay, before the French and Industrial Revolutions, the world was pre-capitalist because capitalism as a sociological entity had not developed enough yet. And it would only develop enough after the French and Industrial Revolutions. That becomes kind of the turning point for everything. So again, you're thinking about time and history in that sense. And all of these sociological entities are moving through it. Now the question, this has been very European. These are very European events, and you might be asking rightly, if you're an Indonesian and you're watching this, like, what does this have to do with me? And that's exactly that is exactly the discomfort that is the point. It doesn't make sense. It's like, why do I have to deal with this, right? Because in a way, like the question that we have to ask is, can you, as a non-European, can you, as an Indonesian, fully inhabit this kind of timeline that is deeply rooted in European history? Is that possible at all for you? And I'm just going to show how you can see some slippages. The first is what we've been talking about, right? We can put things like, I don't know, like the Hungarian Peasant Revolt, an example. Or like the Protestant Reformation in this timeline, and it would make a lot of sense. This is a timeline that is sort of like constructed out of European history. But what about things that do not have a European history? Practices like Selamatan, right? Or like even more telling ziarah, sort of like pilgrimages to the tombs of saints. Very common in Indonesia, but like again, where would you put it here? Clearly, they're contemporary. Like ziarah is such a big thing still in Indonesia today. But if you put it on a European timeline, again, if you made an Indonesian timeline, that wouldn't be the case. Islam ziarah is just like, okay, ziarah just kept going on from whatever. But if you put it on a European timeline where this stuff is supposed to not exist anymore after the French and Industrial Revolutions, how do you map it out? They must inevitably look backwards. Right? Again, it's not, the histories are not commensurable. And that is even more striking. Again, this is another contrived example. I got this from Ben Anderson's The Idea of Power in Japanese Society. What if the sense of time isn't like this? What if it isn't empty? What if it isn't homogeneous? And what if it isn't linear? When Ben Anderson describes the Javanese conception of time and history as like these recurring cycles between this golden age of Zaman Mas and these dark ages of Zaman Edan, and they're always in this cycle. And that's sort of like a lot of the stuff about Ratu Adil, sort of like the messianic sort of figure of Ratu Adil fits into this. And again, it's not empty in the way historical time here is empty, because it has a lot to do with wahyu, which is sort of like this conception of like, I don't know, it's like, I don't really know how to describe wahyu, but kind of like inner blessing. It's like something that you accumulate from nature, from the universe, and it's the accumulation and decay of wahyu. And like in society, that an important, like maybe in society, that's a bit of an anachronism. An important figure is like the king, the Raja, the Sultan, is what's going to drive these cycles. If you have a lot of wahyu, you have Zaman Mas. A loss of wahyu leads to Zaman Edan. That's completely incommensurable with the sense of time, right? And so if this is the kind of time you exist in, can you fully inhabit this kind of timeline? You must disembowel some of this to migrate here. Another good example, you should read the articles yourself, because I just like skim through it. Another good example Sophie Chow talks about this a lot, the anthropologist. Marin peoples in Papua, their sense of time isn't empty, isn't homogeneous. What is empty? Empty homogeneous time is you think of time as like this empty container, and then you can put stuff in it. Like you put nations in it, you put people in it. For the Mayan, the time isn't empty in that way. Time is deeply linked to actual entities and organisms. Time is like, how old is this tree? And so if that tree dies, time is literally disrupted. And if it sounds weird, it's supposed to sound weird, because at least if you think of time in this linear way, that will feel like, whoa, what is that? It's supposed to feel weird. And then finally, we've established that if you're existing in this sort of like empty homogeneous time, and the main protagonists are sociological entities, mustn't you create your own? Mustn't you identify as part of a sociological entity to exist within this time? So, whereas you saw yourself once as a descendant of Alexander the Great, and that's the Malay Sultans, or even just some person in some desa, now you have to think yourself in terms of a sociological entity. For example, saya orang Jawa, I am Javanese as like an actual ethnic group, an ethnic identity. I am Malay, I am Indonesian. And that's where we get to sort of this is why this sort of conception of time is so important in understanding the post-colonial condition. Because there is a double line. We've established that the colonized Indonesians, because they have their own sense of time, because they have their own sense of history, independent of, incommensurable with European time, you can never fully inhabit it. There will always be a kind of discomfort. You must kind of amputate part of your own sense of history, part of your own sense of origins, to live fully within this European time. But you have to insert yourself into this European time because of the colonial experience. In the most literal sense, Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, is now part of the Dutch Empire. And so literally, your history, the history of the East Indies, is part of Dutch history. That's how it looks in the most official sense. Like the Dutch came, and then now whatever the Dutch's own historical baggage is part of like the East Indies historical baggage. That's the historiographical writing and like sort of the reality of just living under like a Dutch colonial power. But also, and this is where it's more subtle, and this is why, even though the Dutch are gone, it persists. The Dutch are gone, but throughout colonial and post-colonial period, as Indonesians, you still confront things like capital. You're confronting things like the state. you're talking in this register, when you're thinking about democracy, you're talking about this language of individual rights. But a certain way of thinking about legal systems, these are things with European histories. And so to talk about these things, to confront these things, you need to inhabit European time somewhat. Because these things existed within European time. They had European origins. And that's where it gets confusing. You have to inhabit this, but you can't. Not really, not fully. And that's how you understand nationalism. Nationalism, I think, was one attempt to bridge this double bind. And again, we have this very European sense of history. What does nationalism do? It basically reappropriates. Okay, fine, we have to do this. We have to sort of like have this timeline. We need to inhabit this kind of world. Let's do it our own way. These are things that we must confront. Things like the state, things like capital, things like modern technology, things like modern science, things like liberal democracy, or the language of like social movements, social all of that. And that comes from this period. But we also have our own past, right? Just like you had your own past, stretching all the way back from ancient Greece and Rome, we too have our own past. And in this way, you're sort of making, it's sort of like you're making this kind of history Indonesian. That's what nationalism tries to do. And it goes back to Chatterjee's point that we were talking about with Leviathan, right? The division between the material and the spiritual realms, on the inside and the outside. Several things, though, that are important about this conception is that, again, narrative structures, the Old Testament, there is an original sin. It's a colonial intrusion. There is an original sin. And then history was Indonesian, in some sense, in a pre-conscious way. And we'll get to, like, I have a quote from Sukarno, which kind of illustrates this very vividly. History, Indonesian consciousness, Indonesian history was developing, and it got interrupted. It got forcefully interrupted by the Dutch. Revolusi Nasional. Revolusi Nasional was the coming of Christ. Was Jibril appearing to Muhammad in a revelation. The Revolusi Nasional was a break by which history becomes Indonesian. Again, this is when you think about it in this way, it's striking the narrative structure. But also, another important point. We asked previously, what does Plato have to do with Elon Musk? What does Sriwijaya have to do with Mataram? What does Sriwijaya have to do with Majapahit? Do they like see themselves in this thing? Again, construction. In the same way the West was constructive, we're kind of doing something similar with the distant past. Right? We're putting them all in a line and saying they're all our ancestors. They're all Indonesian. They're all pre-Indonesian. So viewed from this lens, again, if history is moving in a certain direction, if history has an end, then maybe the protagonist of history in the nationalist rendering is a national consciousness of Indonesia itself. Indonesia becomes more and more and more and more itself throughout history. It becomes more conscious of itself. Mataram was Indonesian. Sriwijaya was more Indonesian, but they didn't realize it. They didn't realize it yet. That's why they didn't call themselves Indonesian. But we do it. Now we do, after the Revolusi Nasional, after Kebangkitan Nasional. Now we realize that we are Indonesian. And this is just a bit of kind of like Aceh stuff. This is not, again, this is not unique to nationalism, right? This is sort of like, again, this is Islamic genealogy where you try to prove like the Wali Songo, sort of like the 9 saints who were said to first spread Islam in Java. And there's like this whole thing where you're like, okay, which lineage do they draw from? It's the same thing here, right? But even in a more religious context, I mean, the website is called Wali Songo Bangkit, so it's like it's sort of Wali Songo rises again. So a bit of a detour. But again, back to the sort of nationalist history and sort of original sin. And again, this is from Sukarno. If you came to one of the sessions on Indonesian Mambugat, this is exactly this quote. And again, let's just read it together because again, I think it's so illustrative. Yes, we used to have a feudal past, and now we live in a modern age. So again, that's that modernist aspiration, right? Of sort of like, we're entering this kind of history. We're not in this kind of history anymore. We're entering this kind of modern history. We're in this timeline. Um, we have no desire to resurrect the feudal past. Actually, let me jump. We only show to the people that the feudalism of the past was a living feudalism, the feudalism of Sriwijaya, Majapahit. Feudalism that wasn't wrapped in pain, a feudalism full of vitality and not one constantly afflicted with illness. And this is the kicker. A feudalism that was full of the possibilities for development, because at least it was an Indonesian feudalism that wasn't sort of like interfered with by Dutch colonialism. Again, there we go. And which were not for the interference of foreign imperialism, would have been able to continue its journey, to complete its evolution. That is to eventually bear and give birth to a healthy and modern way of life. This is striking language. It's a striking language. This is not the language of the social sciences. This is the language of something that is sort of almost like kind of beyond that sometimes. Like it's almost like pseudo-religious, kind of Hegelian, and it's like again, it's like Indonesia was there, it was always there, and it was doing its own thing. It was growing up, and then this abusive parent came in and beat the hell out of it. Now it's back. And that's what we want to do with the revolution. We want to bring it back. We want to sort of like allow it to continue its trajectory. Indonesia becoming more and more and more and more Indonesian over time. And in the same way that you have this state of innocence before the fall, before Adam and Eve ate the apple of Eden, you also have this state of purity almost, right? Of Indonesia before the Dutch came. Not fully developed, but like, actually authentically Indonesian. And that is what explains this. You kept up with this, but this became like kind of like a big online thing. Devolved into memes a lot. This was around 2020, around COVID. I think we had these little micronations popping up, where they claim like this. The one on the left here is a Keraton. Not the full name. It's Keraton Agung something. Well, anyway, they claim to be the descendants of, and they were like, we're a real state, we're a real nation. And then this one here is this is probably, if anyone's chronically online, this is what most Indonesians, Google most Indonesians are most familiar with, Lord Rangga, the self-proclaimed lord of the Sunda Empire. And the funny thing here is like, well, this is not really, there's no links to like the actual Sunda kingdoms of the past, but here's where it gets interesting. Alexander the Great. This is a kingdom, that's sort of his claim. And that's claimed that a lot of the Malay sultans would hate, that they were descendants from Iskandar Zulkarnain, Alexander the Great. And what I think is interesting about this whole phenomenon, because again, when we talk about it, this is a meme. This is a meme. A lot of people don't take it, at least the online communities that I find myself in, or even the offline, they don't take this very seriously. The hoax, blah, blah. And it's interesting when you juxtapose that with how harshly the government cracked down on this. And I think that's because these nations were doing this. This is an actual exercise in legitimacy. Even if like, oh, it's a joke. Like, is this actually like, you are playing on like the actual terrain on which the Indonesian nation state plays. And that explains a lot of the practices that you see in Indonesian politics as well, right? Where you're like, this is purely Indonesian and this is foreign. And what's purely Indonesian is sometimes sort of seen as this thing that like, is like, we reach back to the past. It's almost, sometimes when you see the discourse, it's like, we need to like go all the way back to like this Indonesia that was like sort of like virgin before the Dutch came, before the West came in, oh my God, before like they ruined everything and they sort of like, and a lot of that is operating on this principle, right? And all kinds of Puritanism, where be it like nationalist or religious or cultural, is kind of like getting at that same concept. And so you end up with this weird, and this again, it's the same thing. You come back to the Old Testament, right? It's like you're moving forward in historical time, but in many ways, you're always looking back at that period before the fall, before you lost the innocence when you ate that apple. To go forwards is to go back. The same thing in the French Revolution. They would always go back to like, what was natural humanity like before we got corrupted? It's this motive that just keeps repeating again and again and again. I do want to add a caveat. A lot of this sort of like understanding is deeply informed by the worldview of the nationalist elite. A lot of them came from like the ethical policy. They were sort of reared in sort of like Western Dutch educational sort of institutions. But what about the nationalism of the grassroots inside of that? I think that's something that's a bit more, I don't know if this applies entirely to that understanding. And I want to sort of just throw in there to sort of complicate the story a bit. And that's the story that Ben Anderson tells in his book, where you have this conflict between Sultan Syahrir, sort of representing the Jakarta elite, and Tan Malaka, something that was more sort of grassroots and sort of diffuse, where their understanding of like what it meant to be modern or like what nationalism meant even was very different. That's a whole talk on its own, but just wanted to like throw it out there to sort of like get us to think more critically about all of this. And so that sort of, I'm going to start to wrap up and try to get us thinking about what do we really mean when we talk about these loaded terms like the state or like freedom or like democracy, and it's or like economic development, right? Because what I hope this sort of like timeline exercise shows is that, and Chakrabarti, there's a quote, so I'm going back and forth, this Chakrabarti quote, right? When you think of these problems of modernity, of development, of transition, of capitalism, all of this bundle, really modernity as a whole, right? The sort of like, who is forward, who is advanced, who is backwards? You can't just see it as a problem of historical transition, right? Because you're not just transition, and transition makes sense when you're thinking about a linear timeline, right? You're going from one state to the next. That's transition. But as we've shown here, there is also translation, because you're going from this kind of timeline to this kind of timeline. And so all of these problems, all of these questions, like for example, is Indonesia democratic? Is Indonesia developed? Is Indonesia free? It's not just a problem of transition, it's also a problem of translation. Because words have histories. Whenever you posit the concept for a word, especially if it's loaded, it has its own history. And Indonesian history is not European history. I have a few examples here, for example, the concept of freedom. And think of this in the context of, say, the American Revolution. And this is deeply intertwined with the narrative of the Enlightenment. What is freedom? It's deeply based on this understanding of individual rights, of individual liberty, of sort of breaking free from this despotic government. That is the sense in which freedom is used in the West. And that is the sense in which, again, if you look at commentaries, how sometimes certain people in the West talk about Indonesia or like the rest of the world. Don't the Iraqis want to be free? Don't the Indonesians want to be free? But if you think about the Indonesian Revolution, the word isn't even kebebasan, which is the literal translation. It's not, it's merdeka, which has a very, very different history. This is not an individual finding his rights and liberties. No, this is the nation as a sociological, as an eschatological entity that is breaking free of colonial rule. It's not the same. It's not the same as freedom. So if you just thinking about this in terms of, and purely in terms of transition, is to think purely in terms of like the transitional sort of understanding of freedom, right? In the American or maybe even the French sense. But that is not the timeline that Indonesians inhabit. So you have to think about what happens when you translate that timeline into a different kind of timeline. Same thing with democracy, right? Where here it's the same word, but it doesn't mean the same thing. And I would posit that I'm going back to this slide that we talked about in our last several weeks ago on Leviathan. These two different conceptions of democratic representation. There's one on the left here that's rooted in liberal theory, in contract theory, in people like Hobbes and Locke, and that's very European. in historical thinking and structure, right? It posits like all of these different individuals that consent to be represented in a certain way. So it's based on like individuals consenting and then being represented. It's almost institutional, right? And that's why when you talk about it in this frame, you get this language of like, oh, make sure the elections are clear. Oh, make sure like people are well represented. Oh, make sure like the legislative chambers are like well designed and well proportioned. Almost very institutional, or maybe even educational. It's like teach people to vote, like tell them like they have the right to vote. But I would argue that maybe democracy, in the sense that in a lot of Indonesians, because of their history, understand it, is closer to what we have on the right. It's based not on, again, we talk about this in the Hobbes class, if you want to sort of like go into this in more detail. It's not about individuals contracting and consenting, it's about a nation. It's about a nation expressing itself, breaking free from out of the historical past and into like modern present day consciousness. And in this case, it's not about representation, it's about expressing. You don't represent Java, you don't represent Indonesia, you express the will of Indonesia, you express the will of Java. And I think democracy, in the way a lot of Indonesians understand it, is close. And that's very different from what we have on the left. And so let me just wrap up everything, this entire like confusing and dense segment 3.1. And really here, again, I want to sort of like stick with this framing of like modernity as a kind of translation. If you think about it in terms of translation too, especially if your sense of being and your sense of history is very different from like the sense of history that's like implicit in modernity, but it's kind of like hidden, kind of. And so we started this segment with talking about the scientific revolution, right? About sort of talking about these ideals of science and reason that came out of like sort of what we call the Enlightenment. Bacon, Descartes, Newton. And then we paired it with Edward Said. And again, think of it as an act of translation. This is what it looks like from the perspective of European history, from the perspective of a history that is fraught with colonial roots. Maybe it's not the same, and that's where Edward Said came in. So we talked about Orientalism and how this is a kind of representation. Again, I'm just summarizing. For more details, just watch the previous classes because that'll be it's dense stuff. And then we talked about Cartesian subjectivity, right? This idea of like the I, where you have this like consciousness of like an I that's like spitting out thoughts every minute, right? It's like, oh, I did this, and today I did that. Oh, what did I think yesterday? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And that's, I would venture to say for a lot of us, that's also like a very, you think that that's like, kind of like, okay, that's sort of how we all exist, right? In a conscious way. Not really. Spivak posits the possibility that maybe that's not true. Maybe you have subaltern kinds of consciousness that don't work. And then finally, we talked about the state, right? The state with its own European history takes on very Hobbesian shape, as we see from the left here, kind of representation. But again, translated to a post-colonial and colonial context, it doesn't look the same, because here it's tied to like the nation takes on a bigger role, and the nation as sort of like this thing that like liberates everyone from sort of colonial rule. And what is the key that ties all of it together? It's the uses of history. Behind all of these, behind these two systems of translation are different histories. And that's why they're not just translations, which really good. You're jumping timelines. That's the way you think about it. You're jumping timelines. You're translating between timelines. And that matters because, again, just little these words, it's like history is also a moral and political science whose stakes and complications are never cleared. And when the historian breaks into using the we, because who is that we? What history are we talking about when we say the we? And we think of history as just a social science. We assume that we is a very neutral term. It's historyless, or even like even if it has its own history, you assume that that must be universal history. And I hope we've shown today that that's not true. And that brings us to our next segments. We're going to be talking about Islam and Marx. And the way we think about this is that think think about them as translations. Islam in the 19th century, and then your Marxism, are in many ways attempts by groups who have been uttered by the dominant narratives of Enlightenment modernity, who have a sense of history that's kind of like, oh wait, this is, I see your narrative, I see your chronologies, I see your concepts with the weight of history behind them, and they don't really make full sense to me. Islamic modernism, Islamic reform, and Marxism are attempts by these others to translate that kind of modernity. So in the Islamic case, it's obvious. We've shown how like the Enlightenment narrative, a lot of it is about removing out superstition, moving out of this religious past into this like rational modern. So if you are religious, what do you do with that? And again, we'll be focusing on Islam, but if you don't, anyone who's religious will feel this tension. If you live in a world where to be modern is to be secular, is to have no spiritual faith, what do you do with it? And that's the question. That's the question that Islam is going to grapple with in the 19th century. And the same thing from a different angle, proletariat. Well, like, or at least the classes that do not feel the same sense of history as the dominant class in Marx is telling that led sort of like the Enlightenment. And that's part of it. That's part of like kind of like the big break of Marxism is identifying that, well, there's this unspoken divide. There's this unspoken divide in enlightened European society that is sort of just papered over, and that's class. So uttering in different ways and translations from the other. And when we finally return, this is all just a setup. This is all just a layup for when we finally return to like actual Indonesian history in Module 4, actual Indonesian history. And again, credits to Alvin and the Coretan's team, because we got a lot of these ideas were sort of built from there. When we talk about Indonesian history, popular and official, the starting point is often the 1900s. And that's when we get, and that's really like this, and that's really like begins with kebijakan etis, ethical policy by the Dutch, where they start educating a lot of Indonesians. It's not really Indonesian. It's very Jakarta-centric, and again, it's deeply also nationalist-centric. It's a very nationalist history. It's a history that's sort of like described in terms of kebangkitan nasional, and these are the people responsible for it. Well, we have spent this entire segment, 3.1, introducing a different kind of theoretical lens, which is not the lens of nationalism, but the lens of modernity. And a lot of these struggles of translating modernity as an other. And when you think about it in that lens, the story of Indonesia, you could argue, starts even earlier, in the 1800s. What happens? The Johor Sultanate is split, is partitioned between the Dutch and the British. And a lot of the elites of the Sultanate start thinking. They start thinking, what am I then? And they start thinking in terms of kebangsaan. They start thinking in terms of language, things of culture, and all of these words we're familiar with. Because this partition kind of disrupts their older ways of being in the world. And now they must reckon fully with sort of with modernity. Oh, by the way, my laptop battery is running out, so if the video cuts off, that's why. But the slides should still display, so don't worry about it. So the show will go on. So that's where we're sort of like reorienting. And again, we don't start in Batavia, we don't start in Jakarta, we start in Riau, we start in Sumatra. We start with Malay print literature. So that allows us to sort of like, again, reposition ourselves in retelling Indonesian history. So that's the long-term plan. Now I'm just gonna do sneak peeks for upcoming classes. So the upcoming class will be the last. We'll wrap up everything we've been talking about over the past several weeks. So we'll wrap up these segments on Enlightenment and post-colonialism. So first things first, we are finally gonna have our first in-person event in Indonesia, in Jakarta. So this event, if you are in Jakarta, please come in person. It'll be a first. So yeah, finally. And it's gonna be a panel. Again, this I have this poster, but it's very tentative. Take all this with a grain of salt. This is sort of like, well, everything's still in progress. But essentially, we're gonna have a panel session. It's gonna be led by Azza Hairunisa. And we're gonna have Alf and Brian from the deconstructing team as like discussants on the panel. So it'll be much more informal. It's gonna be like more chatty. And it's going to wrap up everything we've been talking about. And again, I want to go back to, again, this idea of like this creation of Indonesia, right? And sort of like what we're doing with like our historical past. And again, the question is like, was this how Srivijaya saw itself? Was this how Mataram saw itself? Was this how Majapahit saw itself? And then what happens when we reconstruct them into this sort of like arrangement? What is gained and what is lost? And the examples I gave were quite contrived, like the Zaman Edan stuff and the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but Azza is an early modern historian. So she's well positioned to give examples that are much, much more concrete. This is a very creative title. Again, that's the theme is that exactly what she says it is, which is Indonesia and the worlds we forgot we belong to. We used to belong to more worlds. And what do we forget when we think of ourselves as only Indonesian? And here she has a list of them, right? The worlds we lost to get here: the Malay world, the Islamic Indian Ocean, the Nanyang, the Southern Seas, the Austronesian world. And Azza and our discussants are gonna sort of like unpack this a bit more. So please, if you're interested, sure. um, and then finally, once we're done with all that, we're wrapped up with all of module 3.1, and we're going to transition to our segments on Islam. And this will be headed by Alcia from our own team, but also Alf from Joretanes, who we've been collaborating a lot with, and Alf will also be on the panel discussion with Azza. So that's our plan going forward. So yes, thank you everyone. Yeah, let's open it up to Q&A. Oh, let's see the slide. So again, just like raise your hand, sound off in the chat. Yeah. No one questions?
Uh, Perhaps,
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
but just because I didn't follow the form first because I was out. Just simple question that so what would be your recommendations on what we should do as a citizen or perhaps people who later will I don't know here will rule the countries and be part of it as in your point of view. Thank you.
Uh, no. That's the hardest question. I don't have a very good answer for that. But I think like certainly there's one starting point that I can think of, and that sort of like emerges out of this is again what people like Aza and Brian and Alpha are already starting to do, I think. Because again, we're thinking here in terms specifically of time, and that's an history, which is very abstract. It's not something that like I don't know, it's not something that you can sort of like explain away or like like you can't just like sit with a book in one day and then suddenly like experience time and history differently. And so I think the next the most feasible next steps, I think, are to just sort of like continue exploring things and interrogating things from this new frame of reference, right? With this understanding that like a lot of these things that we have about time and history and how we tell history and what that means about who we are very contingent, and there's a lot of different alternatives. And again, partly this is what ASA is going to do next week, right? Which sort of like trying to understand, okay, if this is the history that we're used to, if this is the sense of time that we're used to, are there alternative kinds that exist in the past that we used to think? And that's looking backwards. If we're thinking in more contemporary terms, we can also, it's also important to sort of like engage, I think, with other Indonesians and other communities who might not have that same sense of history, that have the same sense of time that we have, and to approach it with a kind of humility. It's not to approach it with a kind of like, okay, you have your wooden huts. Let me bring you toilets. Let me bring you fertilizer. I mean, you can, but that shouldn't only be, it's sort of like you want to respect their sense of time too, their sense of like, without just consigning them as backwards in the past. And sometimes I think that's the challenge. Sometimes people who are well intentioned, they go to certain regions and they go into certain communities and they're like, I'm going to save them. I can fix it. I can fix them. And I think we've shown here that like, while that might seem like progress in your own sense of time, you might be imposing a kind of like disruption of their own sense of history, their own sense of time. The Mayan peoples, from Sophie Chaw's example, is a good case study, right? They're contemporary. They're there. They live with us today. They're not in the past. And so having this sensibility and trying to sort of build that muscle where you kind of like hold yourself in a bit of like epistemological humility and suspense, and being open to that, I think is probably the most feasible and the most humanely sort of like possible next step I can think of beyond any grand sort of like schemas. I hope that answered the question. Sorry, there was like
Well,
random.
no, that was beautiful. Heartfelt answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have on the chat by Gregorius Marciano. Oh, that's the name. Yeah, Pratanagung Sujaka. Yes, it's sort of yeah. I don't know. It's like one of those. I think it's like one of those like memes and like cultural discussions that just don't go away. But yeah. Yes, Patricia.
Let's go back to Sunda Empire. I was that reminds me, I was at Museum Nasional last year and I saw there's a lot of I think they had an exhibit that's like newly restored arca, relief, etc.
Yeah.
And the curatorial angle for that is very much like if I see a bro on Twitter be like, let's get back to Greek civilization. And I feel like the curatorial angle there is like, oh, let's look at how Indonesia was so great back in Majunya. We are like big civilization. There's like so much to do. But then at the same time, like I feel like that's kind of like a government push narrative to create like an illusion of Indonesia as purely as it was.
Mm-hmm.
And then contrasting that with like the crackdown of all these like micronations. So I wonder if this translation of history affects the policies of the government today, and how are they using that not just in kind of like the construction of a nation, but also in a soft way, kind of like a propaganda. Like for example, like the policy of trying to rewrite history,
Yeah, that's a really good question. What immediately came to my mind is that when you talk about this tension, right, where it's like, Majapahit is great, but like not you. It's sort of like the rewriting you're talking about. I think it's like Majapahit is great, but our kind of Majapahit. It's like, and again, this is any kind of like debate that tries to like claim a tradition will follow these same routes. It's like sort of like, well, I know you read the Bible and I know you think the Bible says that, but that's the wrong interpretation. This is my Bible that we need to talk about. It's not even just secular. It's not just religious stuff. It's also secular traditions like Marxism. Marxists are the most argumentative people on earth. They're crazy. Like it's like the way Marxists talk about Marx and the way they talk about this text is it sounds like scriptural exegesis. It's like, well, we didn't read volume 2 close enough, so like it didn't like and every tradition is kind of like that, I think. Even like again, we talked about like sort of like the canon of the West almost, right? And it's sort of like, who should we include in that? Is this guy Western or is he not really? And I think thinking about sort of like the way the Indonesian government works is quite similar, right? And I think here the clearest examples is, and really this is where it gets complicated for the Indonesian government. What about Indonesian communists? Like they sort of like were part clearly of the revolution. They were clearly part of independence, but they're communists. Like it's I think it's like that's where it gets it's in these spaces where it gets really tricky, right? Or even like what do you do with sort of like Indonesians, and again Indonesians in quotation marks, members of the aristocracy in the past who collaborated with the Dutch. What do we do with them, right? And that sense of like that sort of like tension of trying to claim all of this as like Indonesian, but also kind of like, well, that's I don't know if I want him to be Indonesian. So yeah, that was just me riffing. But yeah, it's like again that's sort of like in the same way the West and Indonesia are constructed, the sense of like this lineage and the sense of connection with Srivijaya and Majapahit is also constructed. And so if that's the case, then it's like, it's like Majapahit becomes different things to different. Because again, Majapahit is a Javanese-based sort of like kingdom, but it's something that like non-Javanese can claim too under the Indonesian umbrella. So it's like a lot of these like constructions, and that's why it's always changing. That's why it's always being negotiated and contested by all sorts of different groups of people. There was a question. Oh, shit. Okay, that's just some rough thoughts on that. Anyone else? Okay, going once,
I
going
have a
twice.
question.
So,
So hi Derek.
uh,
I was just I was just wondering, given that our timeline is constructed differently from the Europeans, can that timeline in any way be used to infer how we perceive what a meaningful progress is in comparison to a more European timeline? Like if Europeans were to quote unquote catch up with us, what would define as worth catching up to per the way our timeline is constructed?
yes, that's a really good question. A very concrete example of that, Hatta's socialism. And Hatta, when he writes about his socialism, this is very interesting because he's like, Hatta was, when he spent time in Leiden with Perhimpunan Indonesia, he was deeply, deeply involved with like labor and social democratic politics all the way in the Netherlands. And so he considered himself a social democrat, and so did Syahrir. And what's interesting in one of Hatta's sort of like pieces is that he writes, Indonesians can do socialism better than the West. And it's like Western socialism hasn't really caught up to Indonesian socialism. That's Hatta's argument. And he roots it in like sort of like his understanding, and which some people have pointed out is also a bit of a mythologization of the desa, of the Indonesian village. But Hatta was looking at sort of like the desa, and he's like, we were always kind of socialistic because we had this culture of like mufakat, gotong royong, the democratic village structures, as opposed to the individualist West. So we could always do socialism better than the West. So to answer to sort of put in your words, like Western socialism hasn't caught, is not, we can outstrip Western socialism. Indonesian socialism can outstrip Western socialism because of these like historical and cultural heritages. And that's Hatta, Sukarno, and honestly, a lot of like Asian anti-colonial nationalists make very similar arguments with. Actually, I can try to pull up the old. This is from an old presentation. I have the actual quotes, and they're very striking. Oh, there we go. The spirit of Asia. Where this is from Sukarno, right? Where he contrasts Asian nationalism to Western nationalism. And he writes here that, like, again, a true nationalist whose nationalism is not merely a copy of Western nationalism. There's a more striking quote somewhere here. Oh, here it is. And he looks at Germany. He looks at Nazi Germany. You like look at that nationalism, a nationalism that sort of like devolves into Deutsche over alles, right? It's like Germany for the Germans, like or Bitcoin. Yeah. But Germany is better than everyone else. It's sort of like he's trying to portray this picture that, like, nationalism in the West is a very racist. We're gonna do them better. We're gonna do it better because our nationalism is suffused with a spirit of humanity, community of nations, international, whether you believe this or not. It's like that's sort of the argument that's being made that, like, Asian nationalism is better than Western nationalism. And then, at some point, they're the ones who's going to be catching up to us. I mean, it's not just Sukarno who was saying this again. Here, this is quite striking, right? There's only a true Eastern nationalism which should be embraced by true Eastern nationalists. European nationalism, which is an aggressive nationalism, a nationalism that only pursues its own selfish interests, a commercial nationalism obsessed with profit and loss, will certainly end in its own destruction. It's not a very flattering picture. And again, Sukarno wasn't the only one making this argument, right? Gandhi made a very similar argument. Sun Yat-sen, in nationalist China, was making similar arguments where it's like, the East has always been more spiritually advanced, and advanced quotation marks, than the West. Yes, the West has outstripped us in terms of technology and all of that, but they're like spiritually hollow. So they're just all going to nuke themselves into oblivion. We're not going to do that. That's why we're going to be better than them. And so you kind of see what's going on here, right? That's sort of like the reappropriation of history, this sort of translation, because you are taking like a lot of like the basic structures of the Western and the European conception of modernity and progress history. But you are but you're sort of kind of making it your own as well. Like we're gonna do this, but we're gonna do it better than you because Asians, we're not Westerners. And that's sort of like the sentiment that is kind of being expressed here. Does that answer your question?
Yes, very much so. Brilliant answer, brilliant a lecture. Thank you for your hard work, Derek.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anything else? 2 minutes to 12.
Hello, Derek.
Oh, hi, Tim.
Okay. Yeah, so
Oh.
thank you so much. This is a very, very terrific presentation as always. So thank you. Actually, today's session reminds me so much of Graeber and Wengrow's work, The Dawn of Everything. Basically, it tells us about the alternative of how people live their life, how people choose to live certain way in like um, manifest or exemplify their way of what so called civilization. And your presentation today, I think it connects so much in how the civilization and history itself is not singular or linear way of thinking and a living, but it's more of many branches or many alternatives of seeing things. And maybe, for example, in Indonesia itself, it's not you took the example of marrying people from the Sophie Chow's work, right? So
Yes.
I think the question is more like how does the policy and like the regulations which requires us to have singular or one way of seeing history, one way of seeing the what so-called civilization be, I don't know, I don't want to say be more be like changed, because it can be like utopian, but how it can be maybe modified to accept the different kind of what's so called civilization, or different way of seeing things, or different way of living, because different context mean different story and different timelines too, and maybe different perception of time. Yeah, thank you, Derek.
No, thank you. That's another very difficult question. I'm gonna have to give it some thought. Let me try to think out loud. One starting point, I think, is because you mentioned like policy, right? And this is sort of like going off of like Jim Scott. And if you attended Hilma, and all of you attended Hilma Farid's presentation a few weeks back, the language of policy, bureaucratic language, is a language. It's not neutral, not at all. Like this language of like policy and sort of like for example, and this is I'm drawing from the work of like subaltern studies scholars, or like, well, Brian is trying to make an argument that it should be counted to like Sarpo no Dirjo, Indonesian historian, and he looks at these Javanese like, was it in Java? It was in Java. Look at these like peasant revolts during the Dutch East Indies, and what comes true is that you're sort of like seeing two ways of understanding it, two different languages. From the understanding, from the perspective of the Dutch colonial administration, how do they describe such protests? It's in very clean, almost bureaucratic, almost like policy-esque terms. And you can sort of imagine a modern contemporary version of this in policy. Yes, the Taliban are gathering strength in the northwest corner of Afghanistan. They were predominantly Pashtun. The Pashtuns have a pastoral, blah, 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 blah. That's. But if you actually try to understand the episteme and the life worlds of the peasants themselves, the language is very different. The language is of this sort of Kiai comes in and starts talking in a way that is reminiscent of all of these prophetic stories you've heard growing up, right? And then he's distributing these jimats, these amulets, the sacred amulets. He is sort of distributing these air zam-zam, kita mandi air zam. Wait, actually, I don't know if that's I don't know if that's thing. I don't want to make claims on that. It's the same thing, but it's very different language. And like what that bureaucratic language does is that it smothers all of this, right? And I think Hilmar Farid talks about it as well when he talks about what's happening in, say, Papua. Because a lot of the discourse on Papua is like, okay, here's what the Papuans need in terms of like roads, in terms of development. That is still ultimately still bureaucratic language. It is not that it's invalid or that it's not useful at all, but it is a language that is shaped by a certain perspective, which is the perspective of the state. It's perspective of like policymakers, people working in think tanks and NGOs. How do the Papuans see it, right? And if the Papuans speak in a language that, again, to go back to Sophie Chow's example, treats, again, what is called multi-species relationality in anthropology, where you sort of like kind of, the tree is not an object. It's not just an object. An animal is not just an object. There's an actual like relational component here, where like if you cut down this forest, you cut me down too. Like I actually feel that pain. How do you take that seriously? How do you respect that on its own terms without just saying, well, they're very religious, they're very spiritual? Again, and I think the danger, I think a good first step is understanding that the first kind of language, this kind of bureaucratic policy language, is itself a kind of language. Translation, right? Not just transition. Bit of a sneak peek to the Marx and social science sort of sections, right? You think about capitalism and how it arrived in the East Indies in terms of the plantation. And that's, everyone sees that. Everyone sees the plantation. Everyone sees the coffee. Everyone sees the chocolate, the sugar. But think about it in terms of perspective. From the perspective of the Dutch, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, it's a profit loss statement. It's a balance sheet. What does it look like from the perspective of the Javanese? A of the actual like sort of like, or like Sumatran or any kind of Indonesian. What does it look like from their perspective? Because they're not, to them, it's not a balance sheet. To them, it might be apocalyptic. The coming, the end times, or whatever. Again, the reason why I'm struggling so much to do justice to this is precisely because we don't know. And there hasn't been enough work done yet, I think. There's been a lot of progress. But I think this is a language, and there's a way of approaching and thinking about the world that feels alien to a lot of us that are educated in a certain context. Another example, I'm giving too many spoilers now, is tuyul. And tuyul, it's like deformed baby ghost that like, if you adopt a tuyul, it kind of like collects money for you, but then eventually it's like a Faustian bargain. The tuyul will like kind of like bite you in the rear end. And there's this brilliant sort of sociological explication by this Australian sort of academic, George Quinn. And he writes that like the tuyul is an expression of social angst, of a social angst of like an uncertainty of the Javanese dealing with cash and the money economy, because that's very new to them. And they don't know how to deal with that angst. But notice it, which is true, it's probably not wrong. But what is it doing? It is reducing the tuyul as like a second order effect. Whereas these people are actually seeing tuyuls. They're actually seeing tuyuls and they actually believe that no, it's there and it's gonna make me rich. It's gonna destroy my family if I keep letting it do it. That reality disappears because you're sort of like reducing it to a kind of false consciousness. They don't really believe tuyuls exist. They're just anxious about money. And then tuyul is just the manifestation of that. But you're already sort of like, sledgehammering the sort of like the actual lived experience of like, no, but there is a tuyul. The tuyul is there. And so that sort of like gets to sort of like, again, to this sort of like, a lot of us who are educated in a certain way are very naturally inclined and are very good speaking at a certain way, at thinking in a certain way, at looking at the world and experiencing the world in a certain way. And that's not invalid. I'm not trying to say like all of this is wrong. But it becomes so natural and so hegemonic that we often instinctively assume that like, well, this is what's factual, this is what's rational, and this is the truth. And really, what all of this is trying to say is it really, or is it just one kind of language amongst many? And then again, all of people who are bilingual, you get this. Some words are just untranslatable. No matter how hard you try, and you feel that gap between words, but you cannot put that gap into words. But you feel it, it exists, and it points to an existence that's sort of like like language is not as totalizing as we think it is. And like all of this apparatus, all of this sort of like social science sort of language, all of this like policy speak, it is a kind of language. And like any language, it sort of like has its edges, or like, it just can't describe certain things. Sorry, it's a really long-winded answer, but I hope it sort of helps get at like some of the stuff you were asking about. Does it? Feel free to like push back or comment.
Yes, of course, always. Thank you, Derek.
You're welcome. Something on the chat. Oh, okay. This is from Trisiani Fania. Not a question, but a thought. But this rewriting of history by the colonial power, that's okay. Reminds me of the way that many seems to perceive the capitalist modernity that is established today as the head of history. This, while thinking that there are not much alternatives to the system, that changing to any other system is moving backwards. Yes, I felt that collectively we would benefit from reviewing what we perceive as progress or civilizations beyond economic means. Exactly. That's the whole Fukuyama and development thing, right? Because when you have like one template timeline, you just assume like everything is going to move on that. But again, like there are many timelines. There's so many different timelines. Nationalism was an attempt to like create a new kind of timeline, or like to sort of like integrate something that was missing into an existing timeline, depending on how you see it. So yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's a big thing. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Also just fizzled out. Anyone else? If not, I think we can call it quits. It's 12:10 p.m. It's pretty late too back in Jakarta or Indonesia. Sorry, just keep assuming. But thank you again, everyone. This has been a lovely session. So again, this is the next session with Aza will be the last for like segment 3.1, post-coloniality and sort of enlightenment. And then after that, Alcia and Alf will take over. I don't know like what timeline they've set, but we'll sort of share everything in the group chat. But with that, have a nice day, everyone. Have a good night, people back home. Bye. Oh, Lucy, do you have another question? Sorry, I didn't see that.
Oh no,
You
I just
had.
want to say thank you for the lecture and happy birthday, Derek.
Oh my God. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, bye. I'm gonna